Let me tell you about the most ridiculous isekai you never heard of. The bus engine hummed lazily as it rolled down the highway, late morning sunlight streaming through the windows and throwing golden patches across worn leather seats. The air was thick with chatter, laughter, and the kind of stupid arguments that only high school classmates can have. For most of those students, this was one of the best days of the year, a field trip, a break from exams and homework. Girls gossiped about romance, guys traded insults about who would win the next sports tournament. Even the teacher's chaperones seemed relaxed, watching the juvenile enthusiasm with a half smile. But one kid stood out like a sore thumb. Pressed against the window, he was dead asleep. The noise, the buses swaying, nothing could bother him. His closed eyes radiated a tranquility that was almost annoying to anyone who looked. While everyone else planned adventures, he seemed to have given up on any expectation before it even started. Tomatika, sitting 2 rows ahead, turned to sneak a peek at him. "That guy can fall asleep anywhere," she whispered to a friend, who giggled. To them, it was just another quirk of a distant classmate. But that peace was about to be ripped away in the most brutal way possible. Without warning, the ground shook violently. The bus lurched like it had been hit by an earthquake. Students screamed. Some fell out of their seats, others grabbed their bags. An intense, blinding light swallowed the entire vehicle. For a few seconds, everything was white, as if the world itself had been erased. When they opened their eyes, they weren't on the road anymore. The bus was gone. Instead of asphalt and familiar trees, a strange and dazzling landscape stretched before them. The sky was deeper, tinted with an intense blue, and in it shone 2 twin moons, hanging like silent sentinels. In the distance, mountains of black stone rose like walls, and gigantic creatures walked on faraway hills, their roars echoing like thunder. The air smelled metallic, almost sweet, and the wind carried a strange cold, as if each breeze came from an unknown place. "Where are we?" shouted a girl, her voice choked with panic. Another tried to run, but when he passed through where the bus door should have been, his body went through particles of light that dissipated into the air. Panic grew, crying, screams of fear, mixed with voices trying to give orders. And into that chaos stepped a figure. A tall man wrapped in a white robe embroidered with arcane symbols that glowed softly. His presence was imposing, almost suffocating. With each step, the ground seemed to vibrate. When he raised his voice, everyone went silent. "Young ones, calm yourselves. This is no longer the world you knew. This is the kingdom of Damned, and you have been chosen to become heroes destined to save our land from the approaching darkness." The words, instead of calming, caused even more confusion. Some students' eyes went wide in disbelief. Heroes? What did that mean? Others, however, got excited. It was as if they had suddenly been transported into a video game. The priest continued, raising a staff adorned with a shimmering jewel. The jewel glowed, and symbols of light began to hover over the students' heads. One by one, titles were revealed. "Swordsman," announced the priest, and the chosen boy raised his fist excitedly. "Elemental mage," exclaimed another, as light in his hands turned into blue flames. The mood shifted. The previously terrified youngsters now laughed, hugged, and celebrated their new abilities. It was like they'd been invited to an epic adventure. Then it was Yogiri's turn. The jewel's glow hovered over him, but nothing happened. The priest frowned, repeated the gesture, tried a 3rd time. Silence. No word, no title, no light. After the incident with the dragon, the group of students never looked at Yogiri the same way. Previously ignored, treated as a sleepy classmate, and even a joke, he was now seen with a mix of fear and disgust. No one dared approach. Even the laughter that once echoed on the bus had vanished. The silence around him was suffocating, as if he carried an invisible barrier. The caravan continued, escorted by knights ordered to protect the new heroes to the capital. They crossed endless plains, traversed dense forests where ancient trees cast eternal shadows, and stayed overnight in small villages. Slowly, the students began to adapt to the new world. Some trained their skills, proud of the powers they'd received. Others fantasized about future glory, already imagining themselves as legendary warriors. Yogiri slept whenever he could, leaning against a tree, closing his eyes and checking out. It was like he truly didn't care about anything. as if he was just waiting for time to pass. But the world wasn't going to let the journey be smooth. One afternoon, while crossing a narrow road flanked by hills, the attack came. Shouts erupted, and armed men leapt from the slopes. Bandits, dirty faces, hungry eyes, rusted swords, and blood-stained axes surrounded the caravan with cruel smiles. "All right, kids, drop your bags and maybe some of you will survive," said the leader, a brute with facial scars. His voice carried the tone of someone used to killing. The escort commander raised his sword and shouted orders, but the knights were outnumbered. The students, terrified, backed away. Some tried to cast magic, but their hands shook too much. Others cried, unable to react. The bandits laughed, savoring the fear. Then one of them noticed Yogiri, sitting calmly by the side of the road, staring at the horizon. "Hey boss, look at that. Kid hasn't even moved. Must be paralyzed with fear." "Good, he'll be the first to die," another said. The leader raised his axe and pointed it at him. "Then finish him off." Yogiri sighed, like someone lamenting the end of a nap. He slowly opened his eyes and muttered, "You had to bother me right now." The bandits charged, but they never even got to raise their weapons. One by one, their bodies hit the ground. Some tried to scream, but life snuffed out before the sound left their mouths. Within seconds, all were dead, scattered like broken dolls. The blood ran down the road, soaking the earth. The students stared in horror at Yogiri. He killed them all without touching them," whispered a girl, her voice cracking. Even the veteran knights, who had seen horrors of war, stood frozen. The commander, still holding his sword, couldn't believe what he'd witnessed. Yogiri just got up, dusted off his clothes, and sat back down. For him, there was no glory, no weight, just tiredness. That night, the camp was steeped in tension. No one spoke loudly. Everyone threw suspicious glances in his direction, but no one approached, except Tomotika. She walked over to him with hesitant steps, carrying a plate of food. She sat beside him, even as her heart raced. They sat in silence for a few seconds until she asked, "Aren't you going to eat?" He looked at the plate, then at her. "Not hungry." "Still, you should eat. If we keep traveling, you'll need strength." Yogiri looked away toward the campfire. "Strength isn't something I lack." Tomotika smiled nervously. "Maybe not, but even someone like you needs company." He stared at her for a moment, surprised. Few had the courage to look directly at him after what they'd seen, but she didn't look away. "Aren't you afraid?" he asked. She took a deep breath. "Yes, but I also know that if it worked for you, we'd be dead right now, so I'd rather trust you than live in fear." Yogiri was silent, but for the first time, he showed something close to a smile. Small, almost imperceptible. The rumors about the instant death boy spread faster than any horse could gallop. The bandits' massacre didn't go unnoticed. Merchants who escaped with their lives told stories in taverns, exaggerating every detail. "He killed them all without lifting a finger," said some. "All he had to do was look and they dropped dead," others added. Within a few nights, the legend had spread across several villages and even reached distant cities. And as with every legend, it didn't take long to attract unwanted attention. It wasn't just common thieves or low-rent mercenaries anymore. These were serious players, driven by ambition, curiosity, or fear. It was during a cloudy afternoon as the caravan crossed a silent plain that fate decided to test Yogiri's limits once more. In the distance, a lone figure appeared on the horizon, a tall man in polished black armor that reflected the setting sun. On his back, he carried a colossal sword, so huge it seemed impossible for any human to wield. The commander went pale. No way, that's the champion of the Northern Guild, a warrior who's defeated entire armies single-handedly. The man approached slowly, his firm steps echoing like thunder. When he finally stopped in front of the caravan, his eyes gleamed beneath his helmet. The voice that came out was deep and dripping with arrogance. "So, you're the instant death boy. I want to see if the rumors are true." The students held their breath. No one dared speak. Even the knights took a step back. The warrior drove his sword into the ground with such force that the earth split. Dust flew, startling the horses. "Fight me, boy. If you can truly kill anyone, prove it now." Yogiri, as always, seemed indifferent. He was sitting on a rock, eyes half closed, nearly dozing. He opened one eye and replied, "You really want to do this?" The warrior laughed. "I do. And when you fall, the world will know that there's no power that can surpass my blade." With a war cry, he raised the giant sword and charged. The ground cracked under his weight. Each step was like the advance of a titan. The students screamed. Some threw themselves to the ground, fearing they'd be crushed. The strike came like thunder. The sword descended with enough force to split trees in half, cracking the ground in a line that stretched for meters. Dust and rocks flew, covering everything in a gray shroud. Silence fell. Had he succeeded? When the dust settled, the scene was clear. The sword was embedded in the ground, forming a crater, but Yogiri was sitting exactly where he'd been, untouched, without even raising an eyebrow. He looked at the warrior and sighed. Annoying. And then, in an instant, the champion's body simply collapsed. The sword slipped from his hands, falling with a metallic clang that echoed across the empty field. The silence was so heavy it seemed to choke. The students trembled in disbelief. Some cried, not from sadness, but from pure shock. The commander, a battle veteran, let out a whisper. Impossible. He defeated the invincible. Yogiri scratched the back of his neck as if nothing had happened and closed his eyes again. Tomotika, watching from close by, felt her heart race. He hadn't just won, he had erased a living myth like it was nothing. And here's the thing, you want to know how Yogiri managed to stay standing even when facing all that? Rain fell heavily that night, drumming on the worn roof of the inn where the caravan decided to rest. The wooden walls creaked, the floor smelled of dampness mixed with the aroma of stew bubbling in a cauldron over the fire. The students gathered at nearby tables, trying to pretend they were safe. Some spoke quietly, others remained silent, but all threw furtive glances toward the same corner of the room, the corner where Yogiri Takatou rested, eyes half closed as if nothing could bother him. The commander, tense, kept running his hand over his sword constantly. Even there, behind walls, he couldn't relax. Since the appearance of the dragon and the legendary warrior, he knew nothing was coincidence. That boy attracted danger, but he was also the only reason they were all still breathing. The silence was broken by the creak of the door. 6 hooded figures entered, their black cloaks soaked with rain. They didn't order drinks, didn't mingle. They walked silently to the center of the hall, and everyone instinctively stepped back, creating space. The air seemed to cool. The leader approached Yogiri's table. His voice was low, almost a dragging whisper, but carried a suffocating presence. "So it's true. You're the instant death boy." The students swallowed hard. Some grabbed their friends' sleeves. A girl whimpered softly. The commander raised his sword. "Who are you?" "We didn't come to kill. Not yet. We came to understand." Immediately, the hall was seized by cold. One of the hooded figures struck his staff on the floor, and shadows rose like tentacles wrapping around chairs and tables. Another advanced, creating a clone of himself made of pure darkness that charged at Yogiri with a gleaming dagger. A third woman blew a purple smoke that spread like venom, distorting images, making students see monsters where there were none. Tomotika screamed, "Yogiri!" But he didn't move. He looked at the clone, and the clone dissolved into dust. He looked at the smoke, and the air cleared, as if the poison had never existed. He looked at the shadows, and they shrank back into the floor. 2 hooded figures collapsed dead, their bodies falling without even a gasp. The thud made the tables tremble. The hall plunged into silence. The leader, instead of retreating, smiled, not with joy, but with scientific satisfaction. "I understand now. You don't need to touch or speak, you just need to will it." He stepped back, eyes gleaming beneath the hood. Interesting, very interesting. With a gesture, the survivors vanished into the storm, fleeing into the night. The students remained motionless, shocked. The commander slowly lowered his sword, unable to process what he'd seen. Tomotika, breathing hard, walked up to Yogiri. "Did you know they would run?" she asked, almost whispering. He yawned. "No, but I don't care either," and he closed his eyes again. But everyone in that hall knew the truth. For the first time, they understood that what they were traveling with wasn't a hero or a monster. It was something far stranger, a force of nature wrapped in a sleepy teenager's body. The silence of the following dawn was shattered by a deep sound. War horns. The sound echoed across the hills, repeated and multiplied until it filled the air like thunder. The ground vibrated under the weight of organized footsteps. From the hilltops they appeared, warriors in rows, armor gleaming under the sun, black capes fluttering, mages with staves glowing with energy, archers adjusting bowstrings with precision, hooded assassins moving like living shadows. In total, there were 100 hand-picked warriors. It was the famous Guild of 100, legendary mercenaries known for taking only impossible contracts. The caravan commander went pale. "We're doomed," he muttered. The guild's leader, a man in red armor, stepped to the front. His voice echoed like a death sentence. "We don't want you, we just want the boy. Hand him over and we'll spare your lives." Panic spread among the students. "Hand him over," one shouted. "We can't fight this," another cried, clinging to a friend's arm. But no one dared approach Yogiri. He opened one eye, surveying the scene with indifference. The commander raised his sword. "Advance!" And the field turned into an inferno. Shadow arrows cut through the sky. Magic exploded in flames, ice, and thunder. Assassins ran invisible, trying to strike vital points. The ground was torn by explosions, the air filled with dust and screams. But then something strange happened. In the middle of the chaos, bodies began to fall. First an archer, then 2 mages, then 5 assassins. No screams, no visible wounds, just death. One by one, the 100 warriors fell. The magic dissolved, the arrows fell harmless, the assassins lost their breath. In less than a minute, the field that had been full of life was covered in corpses. The leader, still standing, breathed raggedly. Forbidden runes glowed on his body, symbols burning his own skin. "You can't keep this up forever," he shouted. "The more you use this power, the more enemies you'll attract. One day, you'll find someone you can't erase." But before he could take another step, his life snuffed out. His body collapsed. The sword fell with a metallic clang that echoed across the empty field. Silence returned, heavy. Tomotika approached Yogiri, her heart pounding. "You killed all of them in seconds?" He shrugged. "They started it." The simple answer contrasted with the weight of the scene. Elite warriors reduced to nothing as if they'd never existed. If the fall of the 100 Guild was like thunder, the news reaching the continent was like an earthquake. Nobles trembled on their thrones, secret sects stirred, and armies began to march. At the heart of this mobilization was one name, General Zerdan. Known as the Iron Demon, Zerdan was a man who had conquered dozens of kingdoms. His armor, covered in forbidden runes, pulsed with dark energy. It was said he'd sold part of his soul for power, and now he marched against Yogiri. The sound of war drums announced his arrival. The horizon filled with black banners, armed soldiers, mages ready to cast spells, and priests chanting incantations. The ground shook as if the earth itself was afraid. The students stood paralyzed. The commander, pale, raised his sword. "This is the end." The general advanced to the front. His giant axe gleamed under the sun. His voice boomed like thunder. "Yogiri Takatou, today I will prove that even instant death can be overcome by the will of 100 men." The army roared. Fire arrows rained down. Magic exploded in the sky. Soldiers marched in unison, and Yogiri slowly stood up. "Always the same thing," he muttered. He looked, and dozens fell. He looked again, and mages collapsed mid-chant. He looked once more, and priests lost their voices, crumbling. But Zerdan resisted. His runes glowed, blocking the death that erased everything else. He advanced, roaring, each step shaking the ground. "I sold my soul to face you, boy. Your power won't stop me." For a moment, it seemed like it might be different. Tomotika held her breath. The students watched in terror. The commander whispered a prayer. Then Yogiri tilted his head, curious. "Die for real." The runes shattered like broken glass. The dark energy exploded into fragments. Zerdan's colossal body toppled with a crash, his axe embedding in the ground. The army froze. Then they fled in desperation, dropping weapons, banners, and screams. The commander fell to his knees, voice trembling. He defeated a legendary general alone. Tomotika looked at Yogiri in disbelief. "So there really is no limit for you?" He sat down again, crossing his arms. "I just want to sleep." And here's the point. You know why Yogiri won even against an entire army? Because he didn't hesitate. He already knew what to do before the fight started. Exactly like you, who already subscribed to Curious Nerd and hit that like button. The one who makes the right decision beforehand never gets caught off guard. The plan to stop Yogiri wasn't born from a single throne or an isolated mind. It was stitched together in secret over weeks, maybe months, in underground councils where rival kings sat side by side, swallowing centuries of mutual hatred in the name of a greater fear. In each of those stuffy rooms, the same name echoed like a curse, Yogiri Takatou. And the weapon they chose wasn't an army. Armies had already fallen like grains of sand before the boys' gaze. The answer came from the memory of forbidden books, from dusty pages that even priests hesitated to touch. The solution had a name, the Ritual of Silence. It was a continent-scale magic designed not to destroy, but to silence, not to kill, but to suffocate. The circle that nullifies, the chains that cannot be broken, the chant that cannot be forgotten. It was said to have been created in ancient eras and not to trap humans, but to stop the gods themselves should any rebel against the primordial order. And that ritual was what the kings decided to bring back. The caravan was led to the Valley of Runes, a sacred field surrounded by jagged mountains. The dry ground was covered with nearly invisible inscriptions, ancient runes drawn in concentric circles so perfect they seemed carved by the fingers of time itself. To the students' eyes, it looked like just an empty field, but to those who could read the symbols, every line was a sentence. When they reached the center, the air trembled. The mountain's silence was torn by the sound of drums. From the slopes, hundreds of mages emerged, their robes shining with pulsating symbols. Soldiers descended in coordinated march, surrounding the valley like an iron ring. And atop a stone platform crowned with gold and iron stood the king of the alliance, the one who had united rivals around a single purpose. The caravan commander went pale. The students retreated, huddling in a knot of fear. Tomotika gripped Yogiri's arm tightly. "They came for you," she whispered, but deep down she knew she didn't need to say it. The first sign of the ritual was a bluish light that ran across the ground, lighting the runes in sequence, like embers in a circle. The air shook. Ethereal chains emerged, wrapping around Yogiri's arms and legs, holding him upright. They weren't made of iron, but of something worse, condensed energy that burned and adjusted to his body, making movement impossible. The chant began. 200, maybe 300 voices united in ancient words not heard for centuries. The sound reverberated off the valley walls, multiplying until it became deafening. It was as if the air itself had been turned into a prison. The Alliance King raised his sword, his voice echoing above the chorus. "Today, the world will be freed of its curse. Today, the ritual of silence will be fulfilled, and the power that defies even death will be silenced." The students trembled. Some started crying. Others prayed in silence, hoping the gods would intervene. Tomotika, tears in her eyes, looked at Yogiri, who remained motionless. "Do something!" shouted the commander, sword in hand, but without the courage to attack. Yogiri slowly opened his eyes, observed the chains binding him, tested their pressure against his body, and sighed. The yawn was audible even amidst the chant. "You really think you can trap me with this?" he asked, his calm voice cutting through the chorus like a knife. The chains trembled, the chant intensified. Mages forced even more power, veins bulging on their skin, eyes rolling with effort. The circle glowed like the sun. For a moment, it seemed the ritual would work. Then a crack appeared, a dry snap like glass breaking. Another crack and another. The chains disintegrated. Mages screamed in panic, pouring every bit of energy they had, but the light began to fail, flickering like a candle about to go out. The accumulated energy didn't dissipate smoothly, it exploded. Mages were thrown like dolls, spitting blood. Priests fell to their knees, their relics shattering into useless pieces. The king himself tried to retreat, but he didn't take 2 steps before freezing in place. His eyes widened in terror. The sword slipped from his hands, and the crown fell, rolling across the floor with a metallic clink that echoed across the valley.
One by one, the soldiers began to fall. Their spears and shields clanged against the ground until the entire valley filled with a single sound, the dry thud of bodies dropping. The silence that followed was absolute. No screams, no prayers, just the cold wind blowing over a field turned into a graveyard. Tomotika, hands trembling, approached Yogiri, her breath hitching, her eyes filled with tears, not just from fear, but from the helplessness of seeing all that. "Don't you realize?" she said, her voice weak. "No matter what they do, no matter how much they unite, you always win. Every time you win, the whole world gets more scared." Yogiri looked unhurriedly and replied with the same indifference as always, "I just want to sleep." The phrase, spoken in a banal tone, felt like blasphemy in the face of so much blood. But it was true. The Valley of Runes, planned to be Yogiri's eternal prison, was now just another cemetery marked by the echo of the impossible. And in the courts, temples, and dark alleys, news of the ritual of silence's failure would spread like fire on wind. The entire continent knew that armies weren't enough. Troops had been crushed before they could even raise their swords. Legendary generals had fallen like straw dolls. The name Yogiri Takatou was synonymous with silence. Silence of interrupted screams, silence of hearts that stopped, silence of cities that closed their doors whenever the caravan passed. It was in the midst of this despair that the riskiest decision was born. Not to face him with brute force, but with what lay buried in the depths of collective memory. Among the oldest scrolls, hidden in crypts and sealed libraries, they found mention of a forbidden spell used only once in the most distant eras, the Ritual of Silence. It wasn't an attack spell, not a flaming sword, not a rotting curse. It was a circle of absolute negation, a prison created to silence even the gods, to suffocate powers that couldn't be destroyed. Its symbols weren't understood even by modern mages, but that hardly mattered. For desperate kings, the promise of neutralizing Yogiri was enough. Thus, in secret, the greatest kingdoms joined forces. Mages, priests, and soldiers were gathered in secret. The chosen valley was no accident. The Valley of Runes, a wide field ringed by mountains, carried ancient inscriptions carved into the ground itself, marks no one could erase. There, the ritual could flourish. There, they believed they could end the threat. The caravan was led there under the guise of peace negotiations. The commander, naive in his hope, believed the promises. "Maybe they've realized they can't beat him. Maybe they'll finally give up," he murmured, more to convince himself than others. But when the students' feet touched the valley's center, the deception was revealed. Suddenly, the ground glowed. Sleeping runes lit up in sequence, one after another, like embers rekindled in a forgotten bonfire. The air vibrated with suffocating intensity, and translucent chains emerged, enveloping Yogiri's limbs and immobilizing him. They weren't ordinary chains. They were made of condensed energy, each link marked with symbols that seemed to pulse as if alive. From the slopes, hundreds of mages raised their staves, their voices united in chants not heard for millennia. The sound reverberated off the stone walls, multiplying until it seemed the valley itself was singing. With each verse, the chains tightened, glowing brighter, and the pressure in the air increased. Tomotika ran toward Yogiri. "What are they doing?" But soldiers emerged from the slopes, armed with spears and shields, forming a circle and pointing their weapons at the students. No one could get close.
At the center, the Alliance King, wearing a crown of gold and iron, raised his gleaming sword. His voice, trained to be heard by multitudes, echoed across the valley. "Today is the end of your curse. Today, the ritual of silence will be fulfilled, and the power that defies even death will be erased." The students' hearts raced. Some cried, others muttered prayers. The commander tried to organize a defense, but his voice was weak against the ritual's grandeur. Yogiri raised his eyes, calmly observed the chains. Everyone else's breathing was ragged, but his remained tranquil. Then he yawned. The sound of the yawn was so out of place that it even froze the chant for an instant. "You really think you can trap me with this?" he asked.
his voice calm and tired, but it cut through the valley like a blade. The chains trembled, the circle glowed even brighter. Desperate mages intensified their chants. Veins bulged on their necks, eyes watered, bodies shook with exhaustion. They poured every fragment of energy into the seal, and for a brief moment, it seemed like it would work. The chains tightened around Yogiri. The runes shone like a second sun. The entire valley vibrated like a drum. Then, a different sound came. Crack. A fissure, a snap of glass. One link of the chains broke, another cracked, another shattered. The runes began to fail, flickering like lamps running out of oil. The mages screamed, trying to regain control. They forced the chant, pushing their throats until they tore. Some fell to their knees, spitting blood. Others passed out from exhaustion. And then, everything exploded. The light illuminating the circle shattered into fragments, as if the air itself had broken. Mages were flung far away, crashing against rocks. Priests lost their relics, which shattered on impact. Soldiers who had been steady wavered in panic. The king tried to resist. Still standing, he raised his sword, but his body froze in place. His eyes widened, and silence took him. The sword fell from his hands with a metallic clink. The crown rolled on the ground, clattering against stones with a funereal echo. One by one, the soldiers collapsed. Their spears hit the ground, creating a macabre symphony of iron on stone. The valley filled with bodies. When silence finally reigned, only the sound of the wind remained. Tomotika, with trembling hands, approached Yogiri. Her eyes were full of tears, not just from fear, but from helplessness. "Don't you understand?" she said, her voice breaking. "They're going to keep trying. No matter how many unite, how many sacrifice themselves, you always win. But each victory only makes them more desperate." Yogiri looked at her for a moment before yawning again. I just wanted to sleep." The valley, which was supposed to be his eternal prison, was now just another cemetery, and news of the failure would spread quickly. The failure of the ritual of silence wasn't just a tactical defeat. It wasn't just a miscalculation or a magical failure. It was a political, religious, and social earthquake that spread like waves in a pond after a stone is dropped. Every kingdom, every temple, every village, every tavern felt the impact. The news traveled faster than any horse, faster than the wind. Yogiri Takatou could not be contained. In the Valley of Runes, the ground still bore marks of the disaster. Burned runes, broken stones, the smell of broken magic mixed with the blood of soldiers. The few survivors who managed to leave the valley wore expressions of madness. Some had lost their voices, others muttered the same phrase repeatedly. He yawned, and it all ended. They were broken witnesses, unable to rationally explain what they'd seen. Meanwhile, the caravan left the valley in silent march. There were no shouts of triumph, no celebration of survival. Even the students who previously sighed with relief now walked with heads down, eyes lost. Because surviving that didn't feel like a victory, it felt like an uneasy truce, an extension of time no one knew how to use.
Tomotika walked beside Yogiri, watching him with eyes full of questions. He, in turn, adjusted his cloak, scratched the back of his neck, and seemed more interested in finding a comfortable corner to sleep than in carrying the weight of a continent. "Do you realize what happened?" she ventured in a low voice, almost begging for an answer. "They threw everything they had at you. Kings, mages, priests, all together, and still they couldn't. Do you understand what that means?" Yogiri raised his eyebrows for a second, then shrugged. They made a lot of noise over nothing. The answer was like a punch. To him, it was just noise, but to the world, it was proof that no barriers were possible. In distant palaces, the news arrived like a death sentence. In the kingdom of Karsum, the royal council met in haste. The hall smelled of candle wax and fear. Ministers shouted over each other, each more desperate than the last. "We need to arm every peasant. If he comes here, at least we'll have resistance." "Resistance?" shouted another, eyes wide.
Didn't you hear the reports? Entire armies fell without him lifting a finger. You want to throw peasants against that? You'll turn them into cattle for slaughter." The king, seated on his throne, could barely breathe. Sweat ran down his forehead, and his hands trembled like leaves in the wind. "He can't be stopped. He can't be stopped," he repeated, as if his mind had fixated on a single thought. In the kingdom of Dalmor, the nobles reacted differently. Instead of open panic, they chose calculated coldness. "If we can't kill him," said a dark-robed advisor, "then we must control him, offer gifts, alliances, perhaps even a marriage. If he doesn't seek power, maybe we can give him something to keep him occupied." But even that suggestion was met with skeptical looks. How do you control someone who doesn't seem to want anything? In the Temple of 1,000 Voices, discord turned into civil war. Monks who once only argued now raised blades. The sacred courtyard, which once resonated with soft chants, now echoed with the clash of steel on steel. On one side were those who proclaimed Yogiri as God incarnate, a savior. On the other, those who saw him as personified ruin, the enemy to be destroyed at any cost. The temple floor became stained with blood. Stone statues were broken by fanatics. The sound of prayers was replaced by war cries. Meanwhile, in taverns and markets, the stories grew. A traveler claimed Yogiri had defeated 100 mages with just a glance. Another swore he was a god in disguise, walking among men to judge them. And there was always someone adding grotesque details, that the whole valley disappeared in the blink of an eye, that even birds fell dead from the sky. The truth hardly mattered. Fear was already greater than any version. In villages, mothers held their children tighter. Some spoke of exodus, of abandoning lands and seeking new continents. Others dug trenches, as if holes in the ground could stop the inevitable. And the caravan became a target of constant stares. Wherever they passed, they were followed by the curious, spied on by secret envoys, watched by hidden eyes. There was no rest.
That night, the commander gathered everyone around the campfire. His voice was hoarse, his body bent with exhaustion. "Listen to me. I know you're afraid. I know it feels like the whole world hates us. But we have to remember one thing. We're still alive. And as long as we're alive, we have choices." One of the students, eyes red from crying, shot back, "Choices? What choices? We're only alive because he's here." He pointed at Yogiri, who was dozing on his backpack. "If he wanted, we'd all be dead already. The only choice we have is to accept that." Heavy silence fell. No one had the courage to respond because everyone knew it was true. Tomotika clenched her fists. She didn't want to believe her life was reduced to the whim of an indifferent person. She wanted to believe there was goodness, there was purpose, but every whatever she heard eroded that faith. Meanwhile, in secret palaces, new conspiracies were born. If brute force failed, if rituals failed, cunning remained. Poison in cups, daggers in the dark, skillful lies. If we can't crush him, we must isolate him, cut off his allies, destroy his caravan, leave him alone. Even the most powerful being weakens with no one around. It was a cruel plan, but it was all that was left. The entire continent revolved around a single name. Every prayer, every plan, every fear, every hope boiled down to him. Yogiri Takatou was now the black sun around which the world spun, even though he'd never asked for that role. And the most ironic part was that he remained the same, yawning, looking for a corner to sleep, turning his face to the stars, not caring about the weight of millions of lives on his shoulders. While kings, monks, and generals tore themselves apart trying to define him, he remained unshaken, indifferent, as if chaos were just background noise to his lazy routine. The failure of the ritual of silence spread like gunpowder. The stone corridors of palaces were filled with hurried footsteps, messengers running, scrolls delivered with trembling hands. It was as if every throne, every priest, every merchant had awakened to the same certainty. There was no wall, army, or prayer that could stop Yogiri Takatou. But instead of bringing unity, this created the opposite. Where there had once been a common front against him, now there was chaos. Some clamored for destruction, others for worship, others for submission. And in the middle of it all was the caravan, walking down dusty roads surrounded by looks of fear and devotion. In one village by the river, the contrast was stark. As soon as the group arrived, the gates were closed.
Guards locked the doors with bolts. Mothers pulled their children inside. Windows shut in a nearly choreographed synchrony. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of running water. The fear was so dense it could be felt in the air, like a sour smell. But in the next village, the reaction was opposite. Peasants knelt at the sight of Yogiri. Some cried, others muttered prayers. An old man, leaning on a staff, approached with unsteady steps, touched the hem of Yogiri's cloak, and fell to his knees, tears streaming from his wrinkled face. "He is the chosen one," he whispered in a weak but conviction-filled voice. "He is the flame that will guide us." Others repeated in chorus, and soon the entire street was filled with voices clamoring for blessings, as if Yogiri were a deity. Tomotika watched these scenes and felt her heart break. With every step, she realized the world had already divided the boy in two. Half saw salvation in him, half saw ruin. But in neither of these sides was there room to see him as a person. To everyone else, he was already a symbol, a myth, a curse, or a god. That night, around the campfire, the mood in the caravan was heavy. The students whispered among themselves, exchanging suspicious glances. Some could no longer hide their tension. "I can't do this anymore. It's like we're being dragged into an abyss. He doesn't care, doesn't protect us, doesn't decide anything, and yet we're forced to follow." A voice shot back, his voice thick with anger. "Don't say that. If it weren't for him, you'd be dead already. All of us would. What do you want? For him to sacrifice himself for our whims?" Silence fell like a blade. Neither side was wrong, and that was what hurt. Tomotika closed her eyes for a moment. She felt divided. She loved the life that Yogiri protected with his indifference, but she feared the emptiness she saw in him. It was like walking next to a safe abyss while he stood still, terrifying to imagine what could happen if he took a wrong step. Meanwhile, behind the scenes of the continent, new players emerged. If kings and temples had failed, now was the shadows' turn to act. Assassin guilds, secret societies, forgotten cults, all moved in silence. Some sent spies to follow the caravan, others sent envoys disguised as pilgrims, hoping to find a gap. In an underground hall, lit only by torches, a group of hooded men debated. "He's not human," said one, his deep voice echoing. "We can't face him with swords or spells, but maybe we can cut the roots around him." "The girl," replied another, tapping his dagger on the table, "the one always by his side. Maybe through her we can break the circle." The words hung in the air, heavy as a sentence. Meanwhile, in larger cities, Yogiri's name was no longer just whispered. Bards sang about him in contradictory verses. Some exalted him as a liberator, others cursed him as a shadow. Merchants sold amulets supposedly capable of protecting against his gaze. Children played at imitating the boy who yawns and kills, turning tragedy into a game. The entire world revolved around him. But Yogiri walked at the same lazy pace as always. If the world crumbled, he didn't seem to care. His biggest dilemma remained whether to lie on his back or his side to sleep. One afternoon, the caravan was intercepted by a small detachment of independent warriors. They weren't soldiers of any specific kingdom, but mercenaries. Their armor was mismatched, their swords without crests. They were men who served not kings, but contracts. Their leader, a burly man with a thick beard, stepped to the front of the caravan. "Hand over the boy," he ordered, pointing his sword. "We don't know what he is, but we know that wherever he passes, death follows. We're going to settle this our way." The caravan commander raised his sword in response. "No, he's under our protection." The mercenary laughed. "Protection? You have no idea what you're protecting." Before more words could be exchanged, Yogiri raised his eyes. The mercenary froze. His body hit the ground like a marionette with its strings cut. The silence that followed was absolute. The remaining mercenaries dropped their weapons and fled in despair. The students, however, didn't celebrate. Some even looked away, ashamed that deep down they'd wished the attack had succeeded. That night, Tomotika sat by the fire, unable to look at Yogiri. His indifference, which had once been a source of safety, now seemed like an impassable wall. "What's going to become of us?" she murmured to herself. "If the whole world hates you and loves you at the same time, how can we live in the middle of that?"
Yogiri, lying with his arms behind his head, answered without opening his eyes. Whatever. It was always that answer, always the same emptiness. And yet, it was because of that emptiness that they were all still alive. The entire continent had already tried everything: sharp swords, armies of thousands, forbidden spells, impacts between ancient enemies. Every attempt resulted in the same end: silence. Silence of the fallen, silence of broken plans, silence that seemed to mock human arrogance. And at the center of it all was him, Yogiri Takatou, the boy who seemed indifferent to being seen as god or demon. The caravan continued, crossing dead plains and snow-covered mountains. Wherever they passed, they saw the two extremes of the world: villages that closed their gates at the sight of the group, and entire villages that knelt, begging for blessings. In both cases, the result was the same. Yogiri passed by, not caring, as if the fate of multitudes was just background noise. Tomikita, walking beside him, carried a growing anguish. She no longer knew if she should feel gratitude or fear. He had saved them countless times, but not out of compassion, just because he was there. His kindness, if it could be called that, was accidental. On the edge of a lake, as evening fell, she sat beside him. The reflection of the water trembled with the colors of the sunset. "Do you understand what this means?" she asked, her voice heavy. "You're not just some lost kid. You're the center of everything. To many, you're hope. To others, ruin. But no one sees you as a person anymore." Yogiri cast a brief look at the horizon, yawned, and replied, "So what?" Tumatika lowered her eyes. She wanted to hate that answer, wanted to shake him, shout that it wasn't enough. But deep down, she understood. Perhaps it was precisely that indifference that made him untouchable. He wasn't driven by ambition, fear, or pride, and maybe that was why the whole world could never beat him. On the other side of the continent, kings conspired, priests armed themselves, merchants sold stories, bards turned tragedy into songs, but none of that changed the fact that Yogiri remained himself, a sleepy boy walking without direction, who with a glance could redefine the course of history. And so the myth grew, and with it, dread and hope. Tumatika stood up, discreetly wiped away a tear, and walked beside him, determined to stay even without understanding, because somehow she knew the journey wasn't just about survival, it was about witnessing how far that silence would take them. The wind blew over the lake, carrying away the last colors of twilight, and in the air remained only one certainty: the world no longer belonged to kings, temples, or armies. It belonged to a boy who never asked for anything, but who, without realizing it, had become the owner of everything. And if you followed this far, it's because you believe in this journey as much as we do. So don't forget, subscribe to Curious Nerd, leave your like to support the channel, and share this video. That way you stay with us for the next stories, because there's still so much more to be told. Thanks for watching.